Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Maribel Morey, founding executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences. Thank you for joining us for our virtual discussion on the field of economics and the global majority, part of the inaugural economics forum of the Miami Institute. We are a nonprofit research institute established in June 2020, established for many of us global majority scholars who have wanted to discover what it would mean to produce scholarship on the global majority in the social sciences beyond the white gaze of a dominating global North Academy and philanthropic circles. By global majority, we generally mean minorities in the global North and the global South generally. We are a research institute for and by the global majority, centering the work of global majority scholars in the social sciences. By doing so, we hope to be playing our part to address inequities in the construction of knowledge on the global majority in the social sciences, and in doing so, strengthening the integrity and rigor of these fields and helping to build more equitable national and international political economies. Because ideas about each other matter. They matter for each other's sense of dignity, for a collective sense of unity and disunity at the national and global levels. And we scholars in the social sciences and neighboring fields play a part in creating these psychologies of unity and disunity among and within the global minority and global majority in the global South and North. Our discussions today will reflect on the Miami Institute's inaugural Forum of Economics, which has included written contributions from economists Drs. Jayati Ghosh, Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Surbhi Kesar, Ravi Kanbur, Grieve Chelwa, and there's forthcoming essays from Devika Dutt and Abhilasha Srivastava. Today's conversation will take place in English, though we would like to flag that as we grow here at the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, we also plan to coordinate events in other languages of the global majority. Y quiero decir lo mismo en español. Aunque estamos lanzando el instituto en inglés, planeamos en el corto futuro coordinar eventos en otros idiomas de la mayoría global, incluyendo el español, le français et le créole. Pour ceux qui peuvent me comprendre, merci pour être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. Today, the discussion moderator is Dr. Grieve Chelwa. Dr. Chelwa is the inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. The Institute on Race and Political Economy is brand new and is directed by Professor Derek Hamilton, whose work on racial wealth disparities is very well known internationally. Prior to joining the New School, Dr. Chelwa was a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Cape Town, and before that was postdoctoral fellow at the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. He's working remotely from his home city of Lusaka in Zambia. For this discussion, please join Dr. Grieve Chelwa along with fellow economists and fellow contributors to the Miami Institute's Economics Forum, whom Dr. Chelwa will introduce more fully. Drs. Jayati Ghosh, Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Surbhi Kesar, and Devika Dutt. Grieve, I leave it to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Maribel, for that very generous introduction. And let me take this opportunity to congratulate you and all the founding board members and all the founders of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences for putting together this really incredible place where the global majority can begin to sort of find themselves. So please accept these congratulations. And thank you so much for putting together this economics forum. So the inaugural forum for the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences is the economics forum. That's not to say economics is very important. I imagine it was a random draw and economics came out first. I'd like to believe there's much else that is important or just as important. My job today, as Maribel has said, is really to moderate and facilitate a conversation on the questions that the economics forum is supposed to confront. I will read that question in a second. But before I do that, it is my honor and privilege to introduce the discussants this afternoon in Zambia, this morning somewhere else, and this evening in other parts of the world. So it is really my unique pleasure and honor to introduce the discussants this afternoon. After I introduce them, I will ask each of the discussants to spend about 5 minutes talking about each of their forum essays. As you know, the discussants were required to write an essay or are writing an essay which will appear on the Miami Institute's website. Basically what I'll ask is that each discussant spends about 5 minutes telling us about their essay, and be very free to tell us what you think are the main points of the essay, right? And then thereafter we'll engage in a discussion really sparked by what the discussants will tell us was contained in their essays. And we hope that it will be a free-flowing type of discussion. So without any further delay, let me just introduce our discussants today. I will start with Professor Jayati Ghosh, who needs no introduction. I saw someone and quite accurately referred to her as an elder. She's definitely our elder from whom we've learned a lot. Professor Jayati Ghosh is a development economist from India who spent about 35 years teaching at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and from January the 1st this year assumed the role of Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I would then like to introduce Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who is a senior advisor at the Kazana Research Institute in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He was a member of the Economic Action Council, chaired by the 7th Malaysian Prime Minister, and the 5-member Council of Eminent Persons also appointed by the Malaysian Prime Minister. He is Emeritus Professor at the University of Malaya and Fellow of the Academy of Science Malaysia. He was founder chair of International Development Economics Associates, UN Assistant Secretary of General for Economic Development, research coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development, and Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. He received the 2007 Vasily Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. That is Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram. I shall now like to introduce Professor Surbhi Kesar. Professor Surbhi Kesar is an assistant professor of economics at the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University in Bengaluru. Her research areas include political economy, development economics, labor economics, particularly informality, exclusion and structural transformation, and capitalist transition in labor surplus economies. She received a PhD in economics from South Asian University in New Delhi and has been a Fulbright Fellow at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She's a coordinator for the Economic Development Working Group of the Young Scholars Initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and is a steering group member of the Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics Initiative. I shall like now to introduce Devika Dutt. Ms. Devika Dutt is a PhD candidate, so I'm recalling this profile from memory. Ms. Devika Dutt is a PhD candidate in economics, soon completing a dissertation at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Devika, please feel free to correct me if I butchered anything there. Okay, so as you can see, we're very lucky to have this quite rich panel of discussants, and we're very, very lucky that they've shared their time with us today. I'll start with Professor Ghosh. Professor Ghosh, I'll invite you to spend about 5 minutes telling us about the main arguments in your essay, and feel free really to tell us as much as you can about your essay. Thanks a lot. And then we'll go to Professor Sundaram, and thereafter Professor Surbhi, and then we'll go to Ms. Dutt at the end. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Grieve. It's really a pleasure to be amongst all of you. So, I was asked to write about bias, discrimination, and diversity in economics. And it was interesting that this was the topic suggested to me, because this is something that has really bothered me for decades in the discipline. And I tried to highlight two features that I feel are particularly disturbing and which I do feel have actually impoverished the study of economics. First is what I would have called the hegemony of the approach, a basic hegemony of a mainstream neoclassical position that is quite unrealistic, to be honest, and makes assumptions that are not valid and not relevant for most economies today, particularly in the developing world. And it denigrates other approaches. It's not just that it actually promotes a particular worldview and perspective, which, as I have argued, is not always factually relevant, but it also actively denigrates and undermines other approaches. And that, I believe, is a very great tragedy, because there is so much richness and knowledge and relevant analysis in the other approaches that is missed out by students, by policymakers, by those who could learn and help understand the economy because of this. The second is, if you like, a kind of geographical thing. There's a neglect or ignorance of work done elsewhere, and especially in the global south. I think Maribel already mentioned the domination of English, but it's not just that. It is the domination of a North Atlantic perspective on economics, whereby the richness and wealth of work and knowledge that is done in many other countries, and particularly in the global south, is simply not recognized. And when it is recognized, it is mediated through the global north. I mean, it is a sad but telling truth today that you and I are both we're based here, which is very unfortunate. It's true, most of my professional life I have been in India, but we get to know about work done elsewhere through the global north, through their journals, through their conferences, through activities that they decide upon, rather than directly with each other. And of course, Jomo, who really is my inspiration for a lot of this and will have a lot more to say about all of this. Jomo is one of the people who I think has brought this to the fore very strongly. And that's why together we were both involved in setting up IDEAS, International Development Economics Associates, basically to get much greater knowledge of what is going on in the South. And awareness and promotion and dissemination of the work done in the global south. There are other forms of discrimination. There's the gender aspect, the race aspect, in India, the caste aspect. There are many other forms. I'm not going to get into that. But I think these are all in a way related, and they all operate to impoverish the discipline. There are power structures that enforce this, of course. The most obvious is through jobs. Who gets jobs, who doesn't? And what kinds of jobs they get. And then, of course, getting the job is also determined by publications. And so journals is the other important means of discrimination. The gatekeeping function fulfilled by editors of these so-called top journals, the ranking of journals, the fact that pluralist or heterodox articles rarely get published in the so-called top journals, unlike in the mid-20th century when they were often published in these journals, and so on. Research funding, all of these operate to perpetuate and exacerbate the kinds of inequalities that I just mentioned. And I think this has impoverished the discipline in many ways. I'm not going to go on too much longer, but just one aspect that I would like to mention, which I think is particularly important for development economics, is that there's this whole worm's eye view of development, which has become increasingly popular. And it's exemplified in RCTs, which I know you, Grieve, also feel strongly about, but in a whole range of other things, basically the focus on the micro. And this has, I believe, taken away from looking at macroeconomic and evolutionary processes in development and in systemic inequalities and structural forces to the detriment of the study of development. I think there's pushback, and I'm happy to see so many of the younger people involved in the pushback as part of this. And I want to once again pay tribute to Jomo's intervention in this. Is someone who brought this up decades ago when very few people were talking about it, and has really been pushing relentlessly for greater inclusion, not just for the justice of greater inclusion, but because actually that is what makes economics more interesting, relevant, and viable. So let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh, for that succinct retelling of your forum essay. I must say that there is a lot more in Professor Ghosh's essay, and I invite the audience to really read that essay. I read it myself, and boy, did it resonate with some of my own experiences, but I also learned a lot about particularly this aspect of the fact that the discipline seems to be, at least its mainstream vintage, seems to be in the service of power and capitalism, and there's a lot in there, and we will unpack some of these issues later on. Before I ask Professor Sundaram to tell us a little bit about our essay, I do beg your pardon. I should have read, before Professor Ghosh started, I should have read the main forum question that Maribel had posed to us. that Maribor had posed to us before we wrote our essays. And really the forum question, which we'll reflect on later on today, is the following. Do you see discrimination and bias against the global majority in the field of economics? If so, how? Also, how would you imagine the field of economics free of discrimination and bias against the global majority? Which networks of past and present thinkers and works would economists center? So you will recall, you will notice that in our panelists' submissions, they're really reflecting in many ways with these questions. And even in their writings, when you do read them, when you get a chance to read them, you will see these questions reflected upon. I'd now like to invite Professor Sundaram to tell us for about 5 minutes what his forum essay was on. Thank you, Professor Sundaram.
Thank you very much, Grieve, and thank you very much, Maribel, for your initiative in organizing this and particularly this forum. Jayati was, by the way, I'm known as Jomo. Nobody knows Sundaram, who's actually my father's name. But I think, Jayati was very kind in giving me some credit for things. In fact, Grieve, I thought I had already taken up my 5 minutes when you read out the introduction to me. But very more seriously, I think it is important to recognize that she, together with colleagues at Jawaharlal Nehru University, has kept the flag of ideas going for all these years. And this, I think, is very important. And I would urge anybody listening to check out ideas and the website and to subscribe and to keep in touch with the debates going on. I have tried in recent times to spend a lot of time challenging a lot of the mainstream thinking. I have, since leaving the UN system 5 years ago, I've written sort of weekly articles looking at different issues. And these are really for ordinary people. They're not scholarly articles or anything like that, although I provide a lot of references to people. And this week, for instance, I wrote about data problems. And this, I think, is not an unimportant problem for the project Maribel has put before us. And the bias which takes place. For example, if you look at the McKinsey Global Institute's report on the harm caused by obesity, the number one cause of economic losses is due to civil conflict. Number two, 2.1 trillion annually. Number two is due to smoking at 2.1 trillion also. And number three at 2.0 is due to obesity. But how is it calculated? You would think that the problems of malnutrition in the world are largely problems of the rich countries. Because how is it measured? It's measured in terms of income foregone. And who earns more income? It's the rich people in the rich countries who earn much, much more than poor people in poor countries, or poor people even in rich countries, and so on and so forth. So there are many biases, including biases of class, biases between rich countries and poor countries, and so on and so forth, which need to be taken into consideration as we try to deal with some of the challenges which we face in this world. Now, this, of course, is easier said than done, but for the essay which I submitted to the Institute, I wrote about a problem among the ruling class, if I can put it that way. This week, in case many of you may have forgotten, this is the week when the ruling class meets in Davos. Unfortunately, COVID-19 prevented the meeting from happening. But about 2 decades ago, people in the Global South started meeting in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And ideas had a presence in a couple of meetings, and we have had the support and leadership of various people, including Samir Amin, who passed away a few years ago, and a number of other people. Some of the, and very importantly, Tandika Makandavire, who was the first chair of our advisory council, who passed away. Grieve may know his name. He's actually from Zimbabwe,
Grieve has written a very fine obituary, actually, of Pandit.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. Maybe that's why he changed his name to Grieve. But anyway, so I think it's very important to remember that this initiative happened about 2 decades ago, and we have been trying to struggle with many of these biases. So I would strongly recommend, for example, many of Tandika's works, which deal with biases, including how many people in developing countries in Africa, for instance, have had to follow trends by the funders of people who fund scholarships and so on and so forth. And the unfortunate thing is that by the time African economists are trained in those fields, the fads have changed. Your cost-benefit analysis might be the fad during the 1960s, but by the time you get cost-benefit economics, the trend has moved on to something else. And so we are always playing catch-up in developing countries. And rather than recognize the name of the game, we really need to turn the game around and turn it on its head. And so we have a lot of people who have tried to do this, partly in the pages of what Ideas has tried to do, and I hope Miss will try to continue to this kind of work. And I hope Jayati, despite some of the challenges she currently faces, will continue to provide that kind of leadership. This, I think, is extremely important. So the ruling class, the Davos class, if you can put it that, if you would like to put it that way, they are meeting, and I'm not sure how the meetings will go, but what they are talking about is basically the struggle between shareholder capitalism and stakeholder capitalism. Okay, now 50 years ago, or 51 years ago, Milton Friedman, arguably the most influential guru of neoliberal economics during the second half of the 20th century after the passing of Keynes, he basically came down very, very hard against those who suggested anything less than shareholder capitalism. And I think this is very important for us to recognize, because underlying shareholder capitalism, the view, most people think that neoliberal economics is about the market. In fact, most neoliberal economies are not interested in the market. They are interested in property rights, and the extension of property rights. That's why I'm very pleased that there's somebody from Azim Premji University, where Azim Premji represents, in a sense, he has made a fortune of the production of generics, significantly lowering the cost of medicines. And one of the last struggles of the late Nelson Mandela was precisely to fight for the public health exception to the strengthening of intellectual property rights through something called TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights. But we have seen also how all this has been used and abused in a whole range of other areas. For instance, if you look at what has happened with the strengthening of contractual rights and the ability of developing countries, of rich corporations to sue developing countries. Not only developing countries, but to sue developing countries especially. And developing countries often give up without a fight because the legal costs of defending yourself are so high with something called the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which is a part of free trade agreements, of many free trade agreements, and not just of investment agreements. So you see the extension of property rights in all kinds of novel ways which have been taking place during the last 40 years. But also very interestingly, this has created a lot of problems. And so the high tide of neoliberalism, if you will, was about 2 decades ago. And now since then, you have seen pushback and pushback and pushback. And one of the important pushbacks, unfortunately, coming from the right has been the emergence of Trumpism and the emergence of what some of us term ethno-populism. So it's very important to begin to realize that behind this is not a clash of, is a clash of different types of views of capitalism, different views of what property rights should be all about. So the reason which Mr. Trump's United States Trade Representative gave for withdrawing from something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership was because it included a clause for ISD, Investor State Dispute Settlement. And the reason why the US felt vulnerable was because, if you remember, President Obama had pulled out of the, had canceled the oil pipeline, which was being built by a company called TransCanada. And under the North American Free Trade Agreement, the US government could be sued by TransCanada for the breach of contract in that particular case. Now, if you look at the change of the USMCA, it wasn't because the USMCA was very concerned about the problems of Mexican people, the Mexican people who were adversely affected by by NAFTA, but rather it was because you will find in the USMCA there is no more the right to sue the US government using ISDS provisions. So I think it's very important for us to recognize the interface between power and the ideology of capitalism and the forms of capitalism. And this is why I think it's very important for us to recognize that it is property which is at the center of this. And it's useful for us to refer to a French writer almost 2 centuries ago who described property essentially as theft. So once again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope we have an interesting discussion tonight. Oh, well, it's morning over there. Okay, Grieve, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sundaram. I will struggle to call you Jomo. I will try to call you Jomo. Makes it easy because those are Jomo and Kwame are 2 names that are close to me in geographical proximity. So that will make it a little bit easy. Thank you so much for that submission. I mean, I think the really interesting point that I'd never thought about concretely is this idea that neoliberal economists, we often think of them as obsessing about the market, but in actual fact, they're obsessed with property rights. And that's a really, really sort of very insightful statement there that really opens up lots of interesting questions. I hope to return to some of those much later. I also want to invite forum folks who are joining to read Jomo's essay on the MIS website, because Jomo's essay revisits Milton Friedman's very famous opinion editorial in the New York Times, I think in 1971, which really made this emphatic statement that the social corporate responsibility of corporations is to make profits. Everything else is irrelevant, which was, I mean, this is really, really kindergarten stuff, but was really, really influential in messing up lots of young people's minds. So thank you so much for that wonderful essay and for this wonderful talk, which really gave us really a tour of sort of historical things. We appreciate that. I'd like to take this opportunity now to invite Professor Surbhi Kesar. Professor Kesar, you have 5 minutes to tell us about your forum contribution. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Grieve, and please call me Surbhi as well. So first of all, thanks, Maribel, for this amazing initiative and for inviting me to contribute to the forum. I'm definitely extremely honored today to be here because I'm sharing the panel with Professor Ghosh, who's been my student, and Professor Jomo Kwame, who we've grown up reading from origins of development economics to pioneers to everything. So it's a great honor. Thank you very much. And I'm sharing the panel with the people who I either personally know. Devika, of course, is the founder of Diversifying Decolonizing Economics, and I'm a steering group member of the initiative with her, as well as Abhilasha and Grieve, of course, who I know through social media and hope to meet you in person soon. But I think one good thing of having these conversations over Zoom is we're able to somehow bypass that. We're somehow able to converse as not waiting for a big global North conference to take place for all of us to meet. So I'll start with some of the main points that I try to raise in my article. So, the question, as Grieve said, was about this issue of identity in economics. What I submit in my piece is that, yes, there's an issue of identity in economics in terms of representation in different spaces, but those are manifestations of something else. And when I say something else, what is really then the issue is the identity of the discipline itself and how it has evolved. Something that Professor Ghosh and Professor Jomo have already touched upon and talked about. So economics came to be known as this queen of social sciences. And this queen of social sciences, of course, one main reason why it could, claim itself that status was its sense of providing an objective and a universal understanding, which was different than other social sciences. But now imagine in such distinct societies and distinct ways of making sense of those societies, how is it that we can have one objective or a universal understanding? It is, of course, then of the various partial understandings, one understanding is advanced as that universal understanding. And whose understanding it is? It is, of course, the understanding of the powerful. And here, of course, I mean the global north. Now, do I mean global north as a geographical entity? No. Global north represented the essence of capitalism, which is why these manifestations take the form of representations of over-representing global north scholars and under-representing the global south scholars. Now, the peculiarity of global north economies in which it became their sense of capitalism, which have been pointed out is not something that just happened. It was, of course, these forces of capitalism which ushered in this phase of capitalism with active use of power, violence, enclosures, mass dispossessions, etc. Now, with global north representing the essence, every other part of the world was viewed only as a shadow of that essence. Or in other words, they represented a lack or a deficiency according to which, and the individuals in the societies which represented this lacks now had to be molded, which basically, and had to be molded along the imagination of the global north economies. And in doing so, every other possibility of global south economies to develop in different ways, to industrialize in different ways, to have different rationalities and progress outside the shadow of this capitalism that global north represented was in fact completely erased. So much so that the study of global south economies, there are some subjects which really focus on global south development economics, but it's as if seen that development economics is a standalone subject that is only supposed to understand this aberrant phenomenon. Something went wrong in the global south economies, and that is what the discipline is supposed to apparently understand. Now, of course, by ascribing the status of objectivity to the global north's way of organizing societies, what also happened is that this very political project of global north's dominance, because of it representing the essence of capitalism, was almost made into an apolitical project. Why? Because something is scientific and something is unscientific. So it's not really something having power versus something not having power. It's a really thing of being universally objective and the understanding, the quote unquote truth with the capital T, which is what global north represented. So there was an active depoliticization of these hierarchies and of this entire evolution, which I believe is one of the most powerful ways in which the mainstream economic thought has progressed in formulating our understandings and in governing the power structures of the world. Now, of course, then when we talk about this, where global south scholars are underrepresented, the top journals, top institutions, top universities, which are supposed to be the flag bearers of objective knowledge, are in fact the gatekeepers of the for the non-mainstream thought. It basically means every understanding, no matter how quote unquote objective, and of course I'm aware of plural ways of objective understandings. In that sense, there is basically not allowing that sort of permeation to happen. So in that sense, global south hegemony keeps getting reproduced, and the kind of strands that do not represent that sort of a global south, a global north centric strands are in fact shaped or are in fact represented as not being objective enough. And after a while, this is not only happening in the global north, rather global south economies also have to curate their curriculums, keeping this mainstream knowledge in mind. So then even if you have a brown person or a black person being represented in these top journals or these top institutions, they reproduce the exact same hegemony, which is what we have to question. And and you have to follow it, because that's the only way you're able to make the cut. That's the only way you're able to break the wall and get in. And then these people are made exemplars of, thereby reproducing this hegemony. And by the way, the process which earlier started as the project of dominance has now become a project which is hegemonic. Everybody from global north, from the global south, wants to publish in these top journals, wants to be accepted in these top institutions, because that's the only way that you'll be recognized to be quote unquote successful. So this is not to say that the fight for representation is not important. I think it's fundamentally important. But there's a task which is probably a broader one. I won't probably say a bigger one, but a broader one at hand. And that is to question this exclusion of non-mainstream strands that challenge these hegemonic understandings. And to just make my point, let me just say, it's not just that the global south strands are excluded. Think about the way academia has evolved even in the US, how all the heterodox departments have been throttled. Funding has been taken away. Notre Dame, erstwhile Notre Dame Department of Economics, and there's actually been a taking away of the heterodox spaces. So it is that we are trying to question here. So what I would say then, the project of representation of identity is therefore a project of repoliticization of the process of knowledge creation, to move beyond just an objective or a non-objective or a scientific or a non-scientific understanding, but to bring in the politics of how knowledge gets produced and what it represents in terms of the development of capitalism. So thank you.
Thank you, Surbhi, for that very interesting presentation of your essay. I invite again colleagues who are joining us to read Surbhi's essay. It's very rich in lots of education. Particularly, the one thing that struck me about our essay is this idea that the identity of the economists themselves is not enough. We have to sort of go and interrogate the identity of the discipline itself, right? And this idea of depoliticization, which mainstream economics like, the cloak of depoliticization that mainstream economics likes to, I beg your pardon, a phone call just coming in, I just turned it off. This idea of this cloak of depoliticization that mainstream economics likes to sort of proudly wear is itself political. And Surbhi is just telling us, then let's get on with the politicization. Let's repoliticize our analysis of economics and bring the political back into the equation. So the fantastic essay and fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I now want to invite Ms. Devika Dutt to sort of give us a 5-minute presentation on her essay. As I understand it, her essay will be uploaded on the website anytime now. So Devika, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Grieve, and thank you so much, Maribel, and for inviting me to this panel and this opportunity to contribute to the forum. I want to echo Surbhi, and I'm so truly honored to be on this panel, given that it's just filled with people I so deeply respect and have played a great role in forming my economic understanding of everything, basically. And I'm specifically referring to Jomo and Jayati. So yeah, I'm truly honored. That being said, I guess a lot the peril of going last is that a lot of what you've already wanted to say has been laid out. So what I'm going to do then is primarily going to focus on what would an economics that serves that actually represents and serves the global majority look like. And I guess do want to build on what everybody else has said, I guess it has been laid out very clearly. The discipline, basically systemic discrimination, characterizes the discipline of economics. I'm pretty sure it characterizes a lot of other disciplines, but I feel like the way it has a stranglehold on economics is quite unique. As we all know, that all the top departments and the top journals and everything top is in the global north. Whenever you think of who top 5 departments, you can think of a few in the US and the UK, and that's pretty much it. When you think of top economists, it's the same top, either we're saying that inherently there's something fundamentally inferior about the global south, which is a frankly untenable and racist argument, and not true. Effectively, there's something wrong with the definition of top, and the way, and the way, like, there's something inherently wrong with the way we define top. And as Surbhi pointed out, that it's very much to do with the depoliticization of knowledge, and what we need to do is sort of reclaim that and take it forward in a way that we demolish the hegemony of the top. We need to reject the hegemony of the top and demolish it. What that would look, I can think of 2 examples specifically, basically from the way the discussion has been going on. First, starting off with geography, it is truly sad that they're probably a lot of times that I get, people listen to me even have to say random stuff on social media about economics. A part of that is to do with the fact that I'm based in the US right now at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And perhaps, sure, I must have my thoughts and everything have developed further since I was a graduate student in JNU in India. But the fact of the matter is everybody seems to take me more seriously now that I'm doing a PhD in the global north, which is quite unfortunate. And I also got to interact with a lot more people from other parts of the global south, as Jayati mentioned, that we interact with other people from the global south, other events and other happenings through the global north, which is really sad. Now, if you think of what an economics would look like if it was actually serving the global majority, I would think that there would be far more. There would be, instead of everybody gravitating to the global north in order to, as Surbhi said, make the cut and get noticed and make some sort of impact on the whole discipline, it would be that basically there's more of a 2-way flow, and that, for instance, and in fact, it would be completely illegitimate to be sitting in Harvard or in JPAL and whatever and pontificating on what's happening in developing countries. I'm an Indian, and I've grown up up until the age of 23, I've grown up my entire life in India. And if somebody asked me to comment on, like, make generalizations about India, I would still hesitate, because I don't do that. I don't study that. And even then, like, just because I am from India doesn't mean that I know everything about it. However, people who study, say, India and don't spend any time here, it's kind of bizarre to me that they can sit in Harvard and pontificate about what's happening in India. I'm not saying that, global north economists shouldn't study India. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that there should be a greater exchange of knowledge, and actually that people who are based in the global north who actually want to study the global south would need to sort of, it would be a thing that you would move your lives to the part of the world that you actually want to learn about and study and research. But right now, what happens is that research funding is pretty much concentrated in the global north, and from there it's distributed to the rest of the world. And therefore, the center of research, the center of funding, the center of everything is the global north. And if it were to serve the global majority, this would not be the case. The people who have to study, for instance, Zambia or India or Latin America would have to spend a significant portion of their lives there and actually learn about it. And the thing is, then research funding would flow directly to them and not mediated through the global north. That is one example of how I think global economics would look, which if it actually serves the global majority. Another example is, for instance, also with, and I guess I'll come to this when I finish my argument. Another problem is also of data. And this is a conversation I just had with Surbhi last week when we met for coffee, is that a lot of economics has become so obsessed with publication and publishing novel results from novel data sets that everything the biggest currency in economics has become a novel data set that you can access. And as I said, research funding, given that it's located and basically concentrated in the global north universities have access to the most proprietary, most expensive data sets that you can possibly imagine, even when it comes to the global south. The few very expensive data sets in the global south seem to be in the hands of the global north majority. And in fact, or the global south is actually data points for experimentation to collect data. It would, if if economics were actually serving the global majority, this would absolutely not be the case. That there would be knowledge, there would be value in knowledge, not just in exclusive proprietary data sets that are in the hands of the few, but actually public knowledge that can be collected and is available in public sources. And therefore, or these proprietary data sets wouldn't be proprietary. And which brings me to my main point, that a lot of problems with economics, which are that it serves a global minority as opposed to the global majority, and speaks the truth of the global minority as opposed to the global majority, is to do with the fact that that's how the world is. It's not so much that economics isn't existing in a bubble, and which brings me to what Surbhi was saying, that part of the domination of the global minority is totally related to this hegemony of the global minority over the global majority in the form of, well, in the past, colonialism, now imperial relations, and all kinds of, and I mean, in this new form, when we're talking about research funding, also with the imposition of austerity through global North institutions on the global South over years, this is not now, over decades. And basically, this is reinforced and justified by economics. The neoclassical economics absolutely justifies this way of functioning. And therefore, as Surbhi said, part of the solution is re-engaging with the politics of it and re-engaging with real world political developments that actually engage with these problems. What Jomo said was talking about how ISDS functions. As economists, this is something that we need to be actively enraged about and actively research or work out how to solve these problems. That should be our main focus. Otherwise, why are we even doing this? It's not that we can't do abstract pontificating. Obviously, we should do that. We should do abstract theorizing. But on top of that, what we need to do is engage with these global movements, because all of this serving of the global minority is related to the way the world works. And it's just a mere justification of how the way the world works. And that's the point. We need to, I guess, it's so cliche for me to, quote Marx in this case, that all philosophers up to now have sort of wanted to understand the world. The point, however, is to change it. And that's what we can never have an economics that truly serves or understands or is not characterized by underrepresentation of the global minority until we actively engage with that process. And therefore, we need to shed this sort of fake delusion that somehow economists are objective, somehow what we're not doing is not political. It's basically serving a neoliberal conservative political agenda, and we need to acknowledge that and change it and engage with it. So there's a lot of, and this was, I guess, this is kind of what we're trying to sneak in with our initiative, which Surbhi mentioned, diversifying and decolonizing economics, even though it's very much an academic initiative. But all of us who are involved really sort of, I guess I can't speak for all of us. I definitely can speak. I know Surbhi also believes this. So this is something we actively want to do to sort of take away the delusion that what we're doing is some kind of objective thing, and therefore engage with other bodies of knowledge and other forms of thinking that would actually support, what I'm saying, that we need to politicize what we're doing, our knowledge production, and in terms of our knowledge is not only for writing in journals, but it's also for serving a public purpose. And that's something that we need to realize, even if it means that we are perceived as non-objective. Anyway, that's what I'll have to say. My essay is forthcoming. I'll lay these issues out in hopefully greater clarity soon. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Devika. That was incredibly clear. I want to say that one of the things that, one of the most intriguing essays I read last year was an essay written by Devika in the wake of the latest awarding of the Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, that Jayati has scolded us not to call the Nobel Prize in economics, because it is not that. It was never in the initial will of Alfred Nobel, but economists and their pretense for scientism, because we were so full of ourselves, we got a Bank of Sweden to endow a prize, which we erroneously call the Nobel Prize. Devika wrote an interesting essay, because as has been happening recently, and I think for good reasons, every time a Nobel Prize is awarded, the rest of the world, the global majority, always says, what? What has this got to do with anything? In a year when we had the pandemic wreaking havoc across the world, as you know, the award was given for something quite esoteric. I think it was given for auction theory or something like that. And the rest of the world was looking towards economics, at least towards the so-called leading economists, to say, is there anything in the discipline for the world at this moment in time but in true cluelessness, mainstream economics, they told them it's the gate and gave an award to auction theory. And Devika wrote a really interesting essay, really sort of laying out his arguments as to why this was a missed opportunity. So I invite people to read that essay. I can't quite remember what forum it was on. Was it Open Democracy? Yes, on Open Democracy. So I invite colleagues to read that essay. And thank you so much again for your talk, Devika, because really it lays sort of like it's at the heart of what we're discussing today. How can we develop an economics for the global majority? And there's a lot in what you said there, and I hope with some time we'll be able to unpack some of those. So say what concretely can happen now, how can we move from where we are to where we want to be, and so on and so forth. But most of the things that Devika mentioned really resonate with me. Somebody who did all the education in the global South, and really had sort of lots of frustrating experiences reading some of these leading works. Okay, thanks so much, Devika. What I want to do, Maribel, with your permission, I also want to talk a little bit about my own forum essay. Maybe it is fun that I do that. I will spend some 5 minutes talking about that, and then I'll open it up for some discussion, pretty much. So Jomo, in many ways, preempted my own submission when he introduced Thandika Mkandawire. So Thandika Mkandawire is an economist, an African economist who sadly passed away last year. He would have been 80 this year. He would have been 80 this year, but pretty much was very much a domineering intellectual on the African continent, and certainly for the global majority and the global South. And anybody who is an economist in the global South or in the global majority really knows who Thandika Mkandawire was, because his presence was really large. He was one of those economists in the old tradition of really not a narrow economist, but really a true social scientist. And I for this forum, I thought I would write an essay about him. And basically what I did in a way of writing about him was to sort of recall for myself the 5 pieces of his that really I think of, in my own opinion, as his most profound essays, the kind of essays that after I'd read them, it allowed me to make sense of my own role as an upcoming intellectual in the global majority, in the global South, and the role of economics in discussions about development and so on and so forth. So yes, as Jomo reminded us, Thandika was born in Zimbabwe, so Zimbabwean born, and then grew up in Zambia, in my own country, and he grew up on the Copper Belt mines, which was really this sort of like festering site for lots of trade unionism. Sort of explains maybe some of his own thoughts around developing economic policy for the majority. So he grew up in Zambia in the Copper Belt province, and then later on moved on to Malawi, where his parents were from, where he initially started his career as a journalist. So he'd wanted to be a journalist, and he said the turning point came in about 1964, 65, where as a young journalist, he was tasked with the job of covering an economic development conference in Malawi. So Malawi had just gotten independence, and the new president then, Hastings Kamuzu Banda, convened the leading economists in the world at the time to descend upon Malawi to help the Malawian government develop a plan, right? A plan for economic development. Some of those, I can't quite recall who was there, but I think Nicolas Caudor was there, and some other leading economists from across the world attended that particular conference. And Thandika's job was to cover it for either the Nyasa Times or Malawian Times, I can't quite remember. But he said the frustration was that all the stuff that was discussed at the conference was really going over his head, because he could not really grasp it. And it was there that he decided to go and study economics. So he then decided right there and then to study economics. But really his journey into studying economics, I'll just ask colleagues to mute their mics if you can, please. Thank you so much. So his journey in studying economics was not so linear. What happened was that he increasingly became very frustrated with the leadership of Kamuzu Banda, the first president of Malawi. And as a journalist, he began to write quite scathing pieces on the government. And on a trip abroad somewhere, his passport was then cancelled and he was declared persona non grata in Malawi. And he then had to find an adoptive country. And I think Sweden adopted him and he lived in Sweden for a very long time before returning to Malawi. He only returned to Malawi after Kamuzu Banda had retreated from the political scene. So this is sort of like really interesting roundabout way. And then whilst he was obviously a persona non grata, he then took up in economic studies. I think he got a PhD in the US, and then he subsequently went back to Sweden. And then pretty early on, Samir Amin, who Jomo told us about, Samir Amin then invited him to come and work in Dakar in Senegal, if I got this story right, with something called CODESRA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa was being established, a very important institution that I asked colleagues to look up. And he was executive secretary at CODESRA for a very long time, and at a very pivotal time in Africa's economic history, because this was the time of the structural adjustment years. I beg your pardon. So this was the time of the structural adjustment years. And then it was in this time that him and his colleagues really produced some of the most insightful analysis of the African economic condition. And it is admirable now for younger scholars like myself to read those pieces, because they were really taking on the hegemonic neoliberal paradigm. You can imagine writing that neoliberalism is not the correct solution for Africa's economic problems in the 80s, when people like Milton Friedman, who Jomo taught us about, when people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, at that moment, him and his colleagues could still objectively write and try, at least using words, to counter this particular issue. So I want to talk very quickly about the 5 pieces of his that really struck me, that I would like to invite colleagues who are participating to read. The first one was a piece that came out in the Cambridge Journal of Economics in 2001. It's called Thinking About Developmental States in Africa. Thandika is really saying in this piece that for African economies to develop, they have to be developmental and developmentalist in orientation, much like what the East Asian countries were like. And I'm sure Jomo can tell us a story or two about his own Malaysia, right? So for African economies to develop, they have to be developmental, which means economic policy should not be narrowly technocratic, right? It cannot be narrowly technocratic. It has to have room for so many other considerations. And African states can be developmental because they've been developmental before. So it's got a history of when they were developmental at some point in the past, and saying that they can be developmental today. The second piece of his that is really interesting is a book that he co-authored with Charles Chukwuma Soludo, a Nigerian economist. And really the book was called Our Continent, Our Future, African Perspectives on Structural Adjustment. So again, he was convening Southern scholars and saying, can we convene as a group? Can we fellowship as a group? And can we then articulate an alternative policy framework to what was then being proposed by the Bretton Woods institutions, which was really structural adjustment, which was really neoliberalism proper, that you have to roll back the state, you have to really get the state out of the economy, you have to so-called free markets reign. And Thandika and his Southern colleagues, mostly African scholars, produced really important empirical pieces, really confronting that particular policy prescription. A third piece of this that I would quickly, I beg your pardon? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. A third piece of his that I'd really like to talk about is his inaugural lecture. So eventually at the end of his career, as he was retiring, Thandika retired into academia, and he took up the inaugural chair in African development at LSE. And he gave an inaugural lecture, which was really titled Running While Others Walk. Right, where he was just saying that Africans really need to run while others were walking, precisely because of the urgency of development. And he makes the argument in there that development is actually developing, and to develop is an idea that has widespread appeal among Africans, precisely because of its emancipatory attributes. Because once you develop, you then escape. History has been humiliating, and the way to do that is really to develop, and we needed to develop very fast. And he articulates precisely in that essay what sort of things we need to do to develop, and pretty much saying what we had been doing in the neoliberal years was really entrenching this humiliation, and we needed to quickly get out of that. The fourth essay is really something that came out in World Politics, and it's called Neo-Patrimonialism and the Political Economy of Economic Performance in Africa. And really what Thandika is saying here is that much of this work, mostly in economics, it has resonance in economics, in political science, and even in journalistic coverages of places like Africa tends to pathologize Africans, that Africans are despotic, they're tribal, they're clannish, all these kinds of things. And these are the reasons why we see these abysmal economic performances. But Tandika, in sublime logic, like he always did, he said, if being tribal and clientelistic and being all these sort of pathological things supposed to be time invariant. But if those things are time invariant, how is it that we see ebbs and flows in Africa's economic performance? We have to seek for much, much more analysis than this very simple type of stuff. And then the last thing that really is very important to me that Tandika wrote was his review of Jeffrey Sachs's bestseller, the book from 2006 called The End of Poverty. Jeffrey Sachs is this sort of big global north economist, and he wrote a book in 2006 where he had very simplistic ideas of how to end poverty. And what Tandika does in his book review, he really just sort of reminds us of Jeffrey Sachs' intellectual itinerary and tells us that Jeffrey Sachs has been many things in different times to many different people, and pretty much then says, don't take him too seriously. There's some things that you can take seriously, but don't take him too seriously. Even those things that you can take him seriously on, he doesn't acknowledge that the actual originators of some of those policy ideas are global South and global majority scholars. So I just thought I would share pretty much with my own forum contribution. Yes. So we had scheduled 1 hour 15 minutes for this particular forum. So I think what I would like to do at this time is to really, I would like to ask the elders, Jayati, Professor Ghosh, and Jomo, Professor Sundaram. I want us to sort of, there was something that they said at the beginning that economics was never really like this. There was a time when economics was very plural, and it was a time when economics was an economics for the majority, if one can say so. What I would like to ask the elders, starting with Jayati, is what changed? Then what really changed for economics to be what it is today, which is an economics for the minority? Professor Ghosh, if you don't mind so much, what really changed?
So I don't want to suggest that things have changed, that there was nothing like a plural, that there was no power structure in economics before. There was, for sure. I mean, Eric Reinert has written extensively about how there was this other canon that was effectively demolished by the Ricardian pushing the Ricardian framework. And let's not also forget that dominant economic theories have generally been those that reflect the dominant politics, the political economy of the time as well, if you like. They have been those that have, Ricardo is talking about opening up trade at a time when it suits England to do that. And so it's not really the case that dominant theories are always, in the past, were necessarily reflective of a so-called majority. Economics has been in the service of power. It is, if you like, the social science that has been most severely in the service of power. Having said that, it is also true that, the mid-20th century, well, let's say beginning from the Great Depression on to, let's say, the early 1960s, was a period of much greater flux. Geopolitically, economically, there was the Great Depression, there was the interwar period, there were all kinds of things going on in the global economy. And then there was the emergence of a whole bunch of new independent states who were looking for new paths to industrialization and development. You mentioned Banda in Malawi, but in India, they were inviting scholars from all over the world. Mahalanobis was, the second plan was the product of a lot of engagement of global scholars. And there was a different kind of confidence in the process of development at that time, which was more open. Even the dominant northern journals of the time, if you look back on those, if you go back to older issues, you will find people like Stephen Heimer publishing, Marxist scholars writing in some of these dominant mainstream journals, which is unthinkable today. I think it got worse with the advent of neoliberalism, if you like. I don't want to blame that for everything, but the change in power structures, the requirements of the global elite, if you like, the requirements of power operated to actually make this, in a sense, much more of a much more restricted. And I think it's got very extreme now. Of course, it's harder to do now with the explosion of the internet. I mean, some of the positives of that are precisely what we're seeing today, that we can get people putting up things on online blogs and forums. Whereas earlier, there was no such outlet. There was no possibility of people reading each other on those and all of that. So that is a positive. But if you like, the mainstream has, if anything, got more rigid and more restrictive, and working more actively to ensure that its views are dominate. And I think a large part of that is because they realize how weak it is, how fragile it is, so that, removing any one card and the whole house comes tumbling down. So I think the degree of aggression that we often see in a lot of the mainstream economics is a result of the awareness that it is really not all that relevant and applicable.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think it's useful for us younger ones to sort of not romanticize so much the past, because we can think that there was a moment when everything was hunky-dory. But I think the important point is that economics has always been in the service of power and the dominant political economy. So thank you so much, Professor Ghosh, for that. Professor Sundaram, Jomo, what was it like being a PhD student back in the day, and somewhat related to this question of what changed really? What changed from it being so plural to being so narrow?
I'm afraid I wasn't a very good student. So when I was an undergraduate, I used to hang around with graduate students. Some of them were not very good in mathematics. I happened to know a bit more mathematics than them, so I spent a bit of time teaching them, but I used to hang around with a lot of them. And so I was very lucky and in learning a lot from graduate students, not so much from my teachers, although I had some very good teachers. The place where I was studying, I also had some unusual visiting teachers. So I learned a great deal from them, but it wasn't a normal path. For example, I think Paul Krugman was my classmate, but I don't think we were ever in the same class together. Okay, because we were doing completely different things, and we were both undergraduate majors in economics, but we never, our paths never crossed. I knew of him because he wrote well, and I don't write well, so I wanted to learn how to write better. But that was the only reason I knew of him. But I think coming back to the more serious question, I think we also have to recognize that one, the significance of power and how power is exercised. So for Africa, for example, and this is something Tandika's other essay, which I was referring to, discusses, the fact of providing scholarships and sending people to particular places was very important in shaping how the subsequent generation, the early generations of African economists were trained. And they were often trained and then became misfits because they were trained when particular fads were significant. So, randomized controlled trials might be the flavor of the month for DFID and for a few other providers of ODA. But by the time you finish the PhD, I'm afraid you might be passé, so you won't have much of a future if that's what you've been trained in. And then you go, and so you have, so it was really the unusual character of Tandika's formation. Mine was less colorful than his, but it was certainly was a very important part of my own formation. But ultimately, it was keeping in touch with the rest of the world. Because I must say that, I remember once getting a lift from Jayati when she was a graduate student, and meeting some of her friends, and they were discussing things which things which I would never do to you, but which they considered to be absolutely essential for any serious understanding of whoever it was who was being discussed. But there were, I think, two important things which were very important. In America, where a lot of students are being trained nowadays, there was a time when training, and this is something Eric Reinhardt, whom Jayati mentioned earlier, reminds us. There was a time before World War II when every graduate student had to learn German. And you had to learn German, you had to learn all kinds of people, not only the Austrian school, you had to learn Werner Sombart, you had to learn a whole bunch of other people as well. And that was very important because Germany, like many other Central European countries, they were latecomers. And so you didn't buy into, Adam Smith. You bought into Frederick List. And Frederick List actually learned his economics from the Broadway musical. No, seriously, he learned it from Hamilton. Okay, so what was Hamilton? Hamilton was the son of probably a kept woman, maybe a prostitute, who had distinguished himself. He had not learned any economics, but he distinguished himself by his courage. And he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. He was smart, and he was basically the first thinker who had to think about what it meant to be economically liberated. What did it mean for an American colony to create a new economy? So he set up the customs house. He set up the institutions which now Hamilton was, as everybody knows now, he was killed by the vice president in a duel, okay? But Hamilton basically had to struggle with problems, and it was only after List visited America, okay? When he visited America, List wrote two different books. One was, which sound almost the same, Principles of the Natural Economy. And then 10 years later, after visiting America and learning about Hamilton, he writes another book, Principles of the National Economy. Okay? Two titles sound very similar, right? But a world of difference, because he begins to realize how challenging it is. Now, many of the people who studied in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, many of them were Jewish, and even if they were not Jewish, they were leftists. They had to leave because of Hitler, and they went to America. And so the first generation in the UK were people like Thomas Barlow and so on and so forth, who had a very different formation. Even somebody like Hans Singer had a very different formation. Their backgrounds were different. They were refugees. And so the whole mentality and the view of the world was very different. So Hans Singer, who comes from Austria, chooses to write a PhD with Keynes on workers. Okay, it's almost inconceivable for most Oxford, Cambridge people to do so at that time. So I think the fact of being sort of slightly excluded, and so you see the contradictions, for example, in somebody like Arthur Lewis. That's why I think earlier there was mention of this books I edited called Pioneers of Development Economics and Frontiers of Development Economics, and how these different ideas flourished in an earlier period. And that flourishing of ideas meant that there was no monopoly. Economics talks about monopoly, about market and competition, but it doesn't encourage market and competition in the teaching of economics. Okay, and it is precisely that competition for ideas which was important. And so in places like in the former colonies, people were uneasy with what they were learning. They might come back with PhDs. Often they didn't come back because it was much nicer to work in Washington or someplace like that. but you came back and you began to look at the reality of what you're faced with, and you were forced to change your mind about many things. So I think that the lived experience of many of these people is also extremely important, you know, and so I think it's very important to begin to appreciate the engagement and involvement. So the more engaged people were with the realities, including the struggles in their own societies, the more I think people develop ideas and sought ideas of their own. And I think this is extremely important for us to appreciate about ideas. You know, it's not as if, it's not as if there are correct ideas which are found to be found in journals and academic books. Correct ideas come from contestation, from, you know, to begin to see how things, whether things will match with reality. And one of the debates I used to have with Tandika was about the development state, you know, and the whole idea of the development state was often accompanied by the idea of, you know, oh, well, you know, what was special about East Asia was that you didn't have democracy. So for Tandika, the struggle for democracy was almost as important as the struggle for development, you know, because he saw that as providing the importance checks and balances, which are so important to ensure that the whole process is not hijacked by an elite. I like to tell the story, you know, in Southeast Asia, you have two island republics and you had two dictators. In one of those countries was growing at 3%, another country was growing at 8%, okay? And why was one country growing at 3%, the other 8%? Because the country which was growing at 3%, the Philippines, the elite was taking their money and putting it in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Hawaii, in, you know, all over the world. In the case of Indonesia, these were people who couldn't speak any other language. They invested their money. These were brutal dictators, okay? They killed over 500,000, possibly 1 million people in Indonesia. But they were brutal dictators who knew that they could make the most money by reinvesting in their own country. And so you have an 8% growth rate in Indonesia, but is that what you want? Okay, so I think, you know, so the view of the East Asian miracle, which was sold to the rest of the world, was a sanitized view. Politics was taken out of that story, and new myths were created. You know, for example, one of the things about
Professor Sundaram, I do beg your pardon. I'll give you about 30 seconds to conclude, but I beg your pardon. We're running out of time, but please conclude in 30 seconds, and then yeah, thanks so much. This is rivet.
My joke will take too long.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I feel bad now, but I think I mean that's the beauty of these forums, that you know, they allow us at least to learn from worlds of wisdom like yourself, and I think you taught us a lot in the submission that you just made, but particularly this importance of it was plural because folks with lived experiences were allowed to participate, either by the shock of the war or the ending of, you know, the independence movement, but this allowed people from all parts of the world to sort of participate in the framing and in the enriching of economics. And this is what one hopes will happen going forward. We're out of time, but I would like in a minute to ask each of our discussants to quickly tell us what they think needs to happen to change the status quo. So I'll start with Devika, going all the way up to Surbhi, and then Professor Sundaram, and then Professor Ghosh, and then we conclude. In a minute, what do you think needs to happen, Devika, to change the status quo?
Wow, that's a lot for 1 minute, but I guess if it has to be one thing, then it needs to be that there needs to be a greater plurality of approaches that is put front and center in every forum, which also engages with what's happening in the real world, not only for the sense of academic journals, academic publishing, but for more than, and to serve a greater public purpose. I think if we have that in mind as economists, I think our discipline would look entirely different than it does now. because I had only 1 minute. Also, just to put apologies from Surbhi, she had bad internet, so she sort of, yeah, she's no longer in the meeting with us.
Oh, okay.
She was unable to join back. I was texting her, so just to let you know. Very sorry about that.
Okay. Thanks for letting us know, and thank you for that sort of proposition. I'll go to Professor Sundaram in a minute. What needs to change? I think much of this you've already told us, but would like to hear it again. What needs to change to move us from here to there?
I think many people are obliged to play certain games, and I fully understand the constraints. We all live under different constraints, and our conditions are very different. I think it is important ultimately to be grounded in our own realities and to recognize that the options which are available ultimately have to do with a concrete understanding of the concrete conditions in which we live. So possibilities for small island states are very, very different from continental states, and so on and so forth. So we need to begin to appreciate our differences, and in our greater appreciation of our differences, we learn a lot in reflecting upon our own conditions. And I think ultimately that will make a difference in terms of our ability to connect with the struggles, particularly the social struggles which we find in all our societies.
Thank you so much. I mean, when I was listening you talk about really grounding economics in the particular, reminded me of something that Branko Milanovic, the economist, likes to say, that a lot of mainstream economics now is statistical analysis, regression with Wikipedia. It's Wikipedia with statistical analysis. You sit in your office and you run a couple of regressions and statistical analysis, and then you go to Wikipedia to fill in the context. So I think really this is pretty much the point you're making. Thank you so much, Professor Sundaram. Professor Ghosh, last but not least, certainly what needs to change?
Very tough. And so because it's such a big area, let me be very specific. I think what needs to change in developing countries, in the economics discipline, is actually for us to move away from a neocolonial mindset. And we all have it. We have it even in progressive economics, where the people in the north who are progressive give us the theory and the knowledge, and we need to move away from that. We need to realize that we are generators of knowledge, and we need to share that.
That's very powerful. So we need to paraphrase what Bob Marley said, we need to cure ourselves of mental slavery or one of those things. So we really need to cure ourselves of this.
Yeah, the colonization of the mind, basically. We have to get out of that ourselves. Yeah.
Okay. In a follow-up session, we'll ask the Doyen, Professor Ghosh, how to practically do that. But that's for another time. That's how does one practically do that? You need to, remove your brain, but we'll get sort of concrete recommendations. So really, my time as a moderator has come to an end. I want to invite Maribel if she has anything to say as we close this very, very riveting forum. Maribel, if you have anything to say as the executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, who's put this very important discussion together. Maribel, please.
Thank you so much, Grieve. And I know we're over time, so I'll keep this very simple at hopefully 1.5 minutes. So much of the conversation reflects what we hope to do as an institution at the Miami Institute for Social Sciences. So really questioning the Global North Academy and also the networks of funding in the Global North. We've talked about it today in conversation, how those two powerful forces are in tandem and exist in a certain geography. So we're asking those same questions as an institution, and we're just starting. So I appreciate your patience as we learn as we do. And always tell us what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. This is a community we're building for all of us, global majority scholars, to have discussions, to disagree. We're not always going to agree on what our vision is of moving our fields forward, but having the conversation is the important step to have a conversation amongst us. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Chelwa, for moderating this wonderful event. And also thank you to Drs. Jayati Ghosh, Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Surbhi Kesar, who's not here right now, and Devika Dutt. Thank you so much for this riveting conversation. I invite everyone to visit the essays and forthcoming essays on the website, and also to sign up for updates from the Institute on the homepage and to follow us on Twitter. So thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone, and thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you all. Thank you, Maribel. Thank you, Grieve.
Bye.
You.
Bye.